Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's Design It Yourself Native Landscape class, along with our co-sponsor, City of Millbrae, and our instructor, Juanita Salisbury. I want to welcome all of you and thank you all for taking the time to join us. We really hope that you and your families are staying safe in this challenging time. Next. Before we begin the fun part of the program, I want to provide you with some guidelines for successful participation in tonight's webinar. As I'm sure you have noticed, all participants are muted by default in order to keep the background noise to a minimum. We will be pausing periodically tonight for questions, and we do strongly encourage you to participate and ask your questions to Juanita. If you'd like to ask a question, there are two ways that you can do so. At the end of the presentation, we'll be using the raise hand feature down at the bottom of the screen. And if you raise your hand, the moderator will unmute you and you'll be able to ask your question out loud. The other option as we go through tonight's presentation is to use the Q&A box here. You can type questions as you have them, and then periodically Juanita will pause in her presentation. I'll read a couple questions for her and she will answer them live. We'll also have time for additional Q&A at the end of the presentation for questions that don't get answered during the slides. I do want to note that tonight's webinar is being recorded and we will make the recording available on the BOSCA website. Next. Before we get started, a little background on BOSCA and our landscape education program. BOSCA is a special district that represents the interests of 26 cities, water districts, and private water companies, all of which purchase wholesale water from the San Francisco regional water system. Our member agencies collectively serve over 1.8 million residents in 3 Bay Area counties. And our goal is to ensure a reliable supply of high quality water at a fair price for our member agencies and their customers. Next. Consistent with that goal, BOSCA runs a regional water conservation program to support our agencies in improving water use efficiency. This landscape education program is one element of our overall regional conservation program. While we've made significant strides in this region in water use efficiency in the past decade, there is still room for improvement, and outdoor water use provides the single biggest potential source of untapped water savings. Reducing outdoor water use through the use of water efficient plants and innovative techniques can help conserve water to ensure the future water supply needs of our communities are met. Next. A few highlights on some additional conservation programs that may be available in your area and of interest to you. First, we have our Lawn Be Gone program, which provides rebates to customers of participating BOSCA agencies for replacing their lawn with a beautiful water efficient landscaping like the one you will learn how to design tonight. We also have our Rain Barrel rebate program, which provides rebates of up to $100 for the purchase and installation of rain barrels. Next. A new addition to our conservation program is the Smart Controller rebate program, which provides instant rebates and heavily discounted pricing on the purchase of the Ratio 3 irrigation controller. This controller can be operated via your smartphone and normally retails for $280. Through this limited time program, customers of the City of Millbrae and other participating water agencies can purchase the controller for $100 plus tax. And last but not least, be on the lookout July 1st for our redesigned landscape rebate program. This program will incorporate the elements of our current Lawn Be Gone program and Rain Barrel program while adding additional incentives for stormwater retention features. I know many of you on here tonight are Millbrae residents, and while Millbrae does not currently participate in the Lawn Be Gone program, they are planning to join the new program as of July 1st. For more information on which of these programs are available in your area, please visit our website, bayareaconservation.org. Next. Looking for additional resources on water efficient landscaping, you can visit our bayareagardening.org website. This site supports residents in water efficient landscape renovations and management. Some of the resources on the site include a gallery of gardens with plants identified, a plant selection tool, and a watering calculator. Next. And last, if you enjoyed tonight's program and want to learn more about landscaping, we invite you to join some of our additional upcoming webinars. We have a whole range of topics, as you'll see here. All of them are free and open to the public, and you can view the full schedule and register at bayareaconservation.org. Next. To enable us to jump right into the main program tonight, I'll be happy to take any questions on BOSCA or our rebate programs in the Q&A box. But now I am so pleased to introduce our instructor, Juanita Salisbury. She is so qualified to be here with us tonight. Juanita has a PhD in biopsychology from the University of Florida, as well as a Bachelor of Science in Landscape Architecture from West Virginia University. In 2009, she established Juanita Salisbury Landscape Architecture after working for commercial and residential design firms. And she's recently turned her focus to California native plant pollinator habitats. In 2016, she established the Primrose Way Pollinator Garden, the first of 5 pollinator habitat gardens in Palo Alto. Her focus is to research and educate about these habitats, as well as exploring opportunities to install more of them. Thank you so much for being here with us, Juanita, and thank you all for joining us as well.
Thank you, Andre. I love talking about native landscapes and native plants and what animals eat. And as Andre mentioned, I do have a PhD in biopsychology. My area of expertise was in gestive behavior, which is eating and drinking. And that turned into an interesting design focus now that I do habitat design. So my focus is always about what food is available in the environment and how to optimize native plantings in order to promote biodiversity. And I have 5 gardens here in Palo Alto where I live. And we have a social media presence both on Facebook and Instagram, the Primrose Pollinator Garden, as well as a YouTube channel, Primrose Way. This is just a little map showing where the gardens are. The first garden up at the top, Primrose Way. Here, it's along Embarcadero Road in Palo Alto. There's the Arcadia Place Garden, which is a cul-de-sac garden, the Island Drive Pollinator Garden, the Gwynda Street Pollinator Garden, and then our most recent one, the Hopkins Avenue Pollinator Garden. And the gardens are always open. They're on public land, so you can go and see them. Most of the plants are labeled. If you want to visit them virtually, they will show up on Google Maps, so you can do a virtual tour. The overview of the talk tonight, first of all, plants, why California native plants, then the basics of habitat design, 3, the basic planting design, what to plant, and then 4, maintenance protocols. And I try to liven up my slides with pictures of insects, pollinators and other insects actually ingesting whatever resources available to them with that plant. I like to get this slide right up at the beginning here. Plants are the beginning of everything. I like to say that nothing really can happen on Earth without plants. They are the primary producers of food and the basis of the food chain. So we take energy from the sun, the photons coming down, which is converted by the plants. This is how we convert photons into protein. First, plants get those photons. Those plants are then eaten by insects. Here's a nice fat caterpillar on a Grindelia camporum. And then lastly, those caterpillars get eaten by birds. And Birds prefer caterpillars for their offspring. They're easy for the young birds to swallow. They're full of nice fat and protein, which you need to have if you're a baby bird. And recent studies show that gardens with at least 70% native plants are needed to sustain populations of birds. Anything below 70% in this study, the ability for gardens, residential gardens, to sustain bird populations fell to 0. So it's all starts with plants. That's how we get our protein. So it figures that I don't really see plants as decorations. Back in landscape architecture school, they would tell us to shrub it up. But that's not really helpful. Plants are actually food. And so whenever I buy plants, I'm always looking for plants that have some kind of chewing evidence on them, because that means I have some larvae, and larvae turn into butterflies and moths. But as caterpillars are food for birds. And this particular plant here is Melicothamnus fasciculatus, and is a wonderful plant. It also blooms with a pink blossom, so provides nectar and pollen resources as well. As I mentioned before, a minimum of 70 native plants found to be necessary to maintain a population of chickadees. And there are so many native plants that we have to choose from here in California. These are ones that are actually in our gardens. Here's a caterpillar on Scrophularia californica, one of my absolute favorite plants. It provides so much for so many. There's an anise swallowtail caterpillar on Perideridia, and this looks like a checker spot caterpillar on Sidalcia. This is actually in my home garden. And then gray hair-streaked butterfly laying eggs on Eriogonum fasciculatum. You can see there's the ovipositor there. And this is actually in my own backyard. So you can have butterflies, you just plant what they like. Why California native plants? California is a biodiversity hotspot. We have almost 8,000 species of plants, some found nowhere else on the planet. We have more than any other state in the United States. We have approximately 1,600 species of native bees. Across the country, there are 4,000 species of native bees. Honeybees are not native. I'm not really going to talk about those. And we have such a huge number of plants and a huge number of pollinators because of our unique ecosystems and because of our species of bees. So we have lots of plants that are very diverse because we have very diverse ecosystems, everything from coastal land to deserts to alpine to redwoods. So a lot of different plants in those ecosystems. And ecosystems are what's growing in those ecosystems is a reflection of the pollinators there. And insect species across the world are declining. It's a big problem. And in some areas of the world, insect species have declined up to 70%. So let's go on. Again, why California native plants? California native plants have evolved to thrive in our California climate. We have dry summers, wet winters, and most of these plants, the Mediterranean types that we have here, are drought tolerant once they're established. And native plants are largely preferred over non-native plants by pollinators. Native plants depend largely on native pollinators for reproduction, and native plants, and this is critical, native plants provide the right nutrients for native insect larval development. It's very specific what caterpillars will eat. They just won't eat anything. If that were the case, we'd have a bunch of caterpillars eating the ivy, and that's just not the way it works. They're very specific into what chemicals are necessary for larval development. When you bring in non-native plants, they can escape cultivation and infest natural areas, disrupting huge ecosystems. They've created diseases, exotic insects, and our native plants keep California looking like California. So they provide an abundance of ecosystem services. here was our Gwenda garden beforehand. Here's the design that I put up to let the neighborhoods know it was happening. This 1,000 square foot triangular piece of ivy had been ivy for at least 50 years, if not longer. We transformed it in about a week, and this is a picture I took just a few days ago. And this garden is only about 2 years old. So these plants can really grow in very quickly and look like a very established garden in a very short amount of time. What to plant? So with 8,000 species, how to make this decision? Well, a good question to start off, we're talking about Millbrae. What is local? And if you go to the calscape.org database, you can search by location. And here I've done the search for Millbrae, and I've taken a screenshot showing what popped up, and you have 698 plants that are native to Millbrae. And Calscape is done by the California Native Plant Society. A lot of dedicated, wonderful, smart professionals maintain this database. It's my go-to for information. And they've broken everything down. You can look at all plants, you can look at trees, shrubs, perennials, annuals, and so forth. So they make it easy to use. But a better question to ask instead of what to plant, here it comes: who to feed, because it's all about the mealtime. Remember, plant species need insects, pollinators, to survive. And something called speciation, where you have changes in the way that plants evolve over time, occurs more rapidly with pollinators, indicating that a biological factor is then more important. In fact, this is something that Darwin talked about in The Origin of Species, that biological factors may be more important considerations than abiotic factors like climate, geology, and water for determining what to plant. So biology is more important than non-biology. And so you can actually go into Calscape again, and you can search to see what butterflies and moths are native to Millbrae. And in Millbrae, you have 331 butterflies and moths that they have listed in the database. And each of these plants, you can click on them. So like with the Anna's swallowtail, you can click on that, see what the larvae like to eat, and then plant that. And you'll end up with the Anna's swallowtail in your habitat. The calscape.org website is really good. I highly recommend it because not only do they tell you about what plants to use, what insects are being fed, but they also give you sources for plants. So they have links to the various native plant nurseries for those resources. It makes it very easy to find those plants. Okay, basics of habitat design. So this is also from the calscape.org website, and I took this picture because it was so great. But basically they're showing things like oaks reaching down into the deep moisture here, pulling it up, and then through the lateral roots across the surface, trees share water. And so an oak will share what it pulls up from the ground with things like heteromelies, toyon, coyote bush, and so forth. So a lot goes on underground that we can't see, but it's not any less important. So a great way to get a lot of sharing of water and resources is to plant something that's very deep-rooted. I've taken this particular concept with my own little sketch here a little bit further. So I'm showing groundwater here at the bottom. This black line is kind of the ground plane. And what I'm trying to convey in this particular picture is that in a habitat, you want to increase the amount of connections that you have between species, plants and animals. And there are a number of ways to do that. When you increase connectivity, you increase complexity. And so let's look at moisture, because everything needs water to live. You can create a swale, which is a depression along the ground surface, which will collect moisture. That moisture then seeps into the groundwater, is taken up by trees, And then the trees actually perform half of our water cycle by exuding water out into the air, and you end up with cloud formation. This is half of the water cycle. The other half is evaporation over the oceans, but trees actually are the other things that drive the water cycle. So what else do we have underground that's happening here? So under the tree, we've got leaves. Leaves should always be under trees like this. Rocks, for example, will trap moisture underneath. You can have moisture in the swale, and you can have moisture under leaves. What I've noticed is that when you have something like a pile of leaves and twigs, is that plants that spread by runners, those runners will head right towards that pile of leaves because of the moisture. You can have things in the bottom of a swale, like a ground cover like Achillea millefolium, otherwise known as yarrow, and you can interplant that plant with things like geophytes, bulbs, native bulbs. We have a ton of different kinds, and those plants are very happy to live together like this. So a lot of different ways to increase complexity. You can have shrubs that have vines growing up into them. So you can have connectivity between the water cycle, but you can also increase connectivity in this vertical fashion by layering in plants. And then that also increases connectivity above the ground in sort of a horizontal fashion as well as below ground. So that's just a little cartoon with my ideas about how these things work. And I get a lot of design tips from nature. This picture was actually taken at the Olympic National Park up in the state of Washington. It's a biosphere reserve, and if you want tips on nature, this is a place to go. So plants are often layered together in nature. And I literally just pointed my camera in a random direction and show a number of different species in about 5 square feet. We've got a succulent in here, there's a cedar tree. In the back, there's a wild rose, there's grass growing, there's a ground cover Arctostaphylos. You know, so, okay, plants like to grow together. This is one tip. Another example of this layering is to put bulbs together in with annuals. So here we have some brodeas, these purple flowers coming up amongst tidy tips, which are annuals. The bulbs reoccur every year because they're bulbs. They die down. They like it dry in the summer times. They don't rot. And the tidy tips will reseed themselves in place. So a great inspiration here. This is taken at Edgewood Park. You see there's also some little clovers in there. Wonderful resources for pollinators. Another planting inspiration, actually went last year down to Pinnacles National Park, which has the highest concentration of bees in California, looking for design inspiration. And here I have a hillside showing these dark blue flowers, which are delphiniums, our native delphiniums, and our native bulbs, probably Dicoleostema. Again, growing together. These come up in the spring, they bloom, and then they die back. Very much the same with the bulbs. You can plant these two things together in just these giant masses here. Remember, the reflection of what you see here is a reflection of the pollinators that are present. So there's going to be a lot of flowers here, as well as a lot of different bee species. So, habitat planting basics. To start with, your plant palette should include 3 species for each of the early, mid, and late bloom times. That is 9 different species minimum. You have pollinators emerging at different times. They don't all come out at once. There's some peak in January, others peak in March, others don't come out until fall. So you want to have overlapping bloom times to keep organisms foraging in the garden. Again, if you provide a diversity of blooms and plant resources, you're going to attract a diversity of pollinators and other insects. What we find is gardens with at least 20 different types of blooming plants is ideal for attracting a diversity of pollinators. And that's what we like to shoot for in our gardens to start with, at least 20 different types. and working our way up between 60 and 80 species. I've noticed in our garden, our Island Drive garden, where we have over 70 species, that we get a huge diversity of pollinators. You should have plants occurring in masses of a single species of at least 3 feet or more in diameter to enhance foraging efficiency. It's just easier to go from plant to plant to plant if they're all relatively close together. And pollinators exhibit what's called floral constancy, which means that they will stick with one type of flower at a time. So they will stick with all of the lupins, then all of the asters. They don't go from aster to lupin, then back and forth. They generally stay with one type of flower at a time. And masses are important. We need a lot of food for these insects. In one study, 85% of 41 bee species required all the pollen from more than 30 flowers for one larva. Other species required all the pollen from over 1,000 flowers for one larva. And also another thing, we bear dirt for our ground-dwelling bees. Most of our native bees dwell underground, about 70% of those. Choose, then plant trees first, then shrubs, then perennials, then bulbs, vines, and so forth. And so you'll be providing abundant nectar, pollen, and vegetative resources. And if you plant the plants that I have listed throughout these slides, you'll end up with the same organisms that we have. A great plant here again, Eriogonum fasciculatum, used by a number of different species, everything from skippers to gray hair streaked butterflies to all kinds of bees and flies, beetles. Every insect seems to really like that plant, and it uses almost no water.
Juanita, you have a question.
Yes, so before I get into this one.
For the next one, for the plants of different bloom times, do you plant those 3 different bloom times plants together, or do you separate them in different areas?
So it really depends on the species and the site. So I try to spread out over the entire habitat things that are blooming sequentially, so that you don't have the north end of the garden in bloom in the spring and the south end of the garden in bloom in the fall. You know, I try to, by the technique of layering in different plants, there's almost always something in every part of the garden that's in bloom.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so in this particular picture, this is our generic landscape plan that we mentioned. And this is also my imaginary plan. This doesn't actually exist in real life, but it, I think, illustrates a number of different points I would like to make that make it very important to really optimize what you're planting. Remember, if you're planting, you're going to have insects, so you want to make it as nice as possible for them. So let's say this is your house back here. Here's your fence line around the outside. You have your patio. Okay, this is about 60 by 100 feet. My yard is about half this, maybe a third the size of that, but nevertheless. So here you have your door going to the outside, a window, and I'm going to say that if you can't get out to the garden, one thing that you can do to really help pollinators is put blackout shades and blackout fabric in all your windows, so that you can really cut down on the transmission of light to the outside at night. We can lose about 30% of insects at night that are attracted to light. And if your whole point of your garden is to get more insects, you don't want to kill them by your outdoor lights. So your outdoor lighting should also be on motion sensors. And so let's say we have this hardscape. There's a little bench here, there's a table with an arbor, here's a barbecue with some seating. And then you've got downspouts on either side, and then creating a swale. This is a connected swale going from both sides, creating a low point because getting moisture back into the ground is good. And going out then to the garden, let's say, okay, so you have your patio, you want a vegetable bed, you want a gazebo, fine. You have some stepping stones going out because you basically want to reduce the amount of paving that you have in your habitat. Remember, 70% of native bees are going to be ground-dwelling bees, and so anytime you put down paving, you're going to preclude that area for them to nest in. Okay, so, and at some point, if you wanted to go back and look at this particular plan, these are all of my go-to plants, and there's quite a number here. So again, I like to consider the design process here as nutrient design or a buffet. Again, aim to plant at least 20 different species, choose those for richness and food resources. And I try to get plants that will feed the most insects. That is, plants that provide both pollen and nectar for pollinators, and that are also larval food sources. So you're taking care of 3 nutrient needs with 1 plant. Again, use the swales for creating moist areas. Moist areas in a garden become prime real estate. And because my degree is also in psychology, I like to think about what are insects seeing. Okay, they have really tiny brains, so there's not a lot of neurons processing information here. But the things that they really respond to well are edges. Edges are super important visual cues for insects. So one study discovered that milkweed, for example, which monarch butterflies use, was used more when it was on the edge of a habitat in a mass rather than sporadically placed throughout. So because it was really distinct for the butterflies, because remember, they don't have a lot of neurons, they don't have a lot of nerves, brain cells. So you want to make it easy for them. And that's also why I like to use mass plantings, because visually it provides a lot of cues for the insects. Oh, there it is, because they have to sometimes come from far away. And if you have a big mass of something, it's easier for them to find it. So edges are really important. And you can create edges. A pathway creates a huge linear edge there. And plant at all scales and planes. Start with large trees and shrubs, then increase in complexity and nutrients with smaller plants like vines, ground covers, geophytes, succulents, etc. So in this backyard design, I've got a big oak tree here with some leaves underneath, and then maybe some Sisyrinchium planted here along the edge, Cercocarpus betuloides, Heteromeles planted along here, Arctostaphylos, redbud, coffeeberry, Prunus salicifolia, Prunus virginiana, Scrophularia, Ceanothus, Eriogonum, couple of different kinds, maybe some Lepicinia, some Verbena, big patch of milkweed, more Ceanothus, Salvia, grasses for skipper butterflies to lay their eggs on, Vaccinium ovatum, our native huckleberry, Baccharis pilularis, a couple of big patches of Phacelia tanacetifolia, and I will be talking about these plants in more detail. Huge patch of Eriogonum. Here's your vegetable bed next to your big patch of Heterotheca. So, and then of course some rocks, and then in the swale you can have something else planted, and you can underplant the whole pathway with something, a nice ground cover like Viola adunca, which is a great butterfly plant, and it spreads nicely. So a lot of different ways to get plants into a landscape in mass. Little patch of poppies over here. Poppies are wonderful plants. But so I keep seeing questions pop up. Is there a burning question that we need to take?
Sure, just a couple quick ones. Can you point out in this design, where are the edges?
Okay, so yes, so the edges, so the pathway provides a big edge, okay? Your eye is drawn to a line, and a line forms an edge. And that edge, there's an edge here, there's an edge here, there's an edge there, an edge there. There's edges this way, there's edges all along here. And also, too, there's an edge there, an edge there. So a mass forms edges. There are edges along the swale. So again, it's a linear thing here. And planting along the form of the swale here, which loops around, just reinforces that edge. So insects will follow these cues and are led then into a garden to patches of things. And one of the things that I like to emphasize in my gardens is I don't like to change things very rapidly, especially during the height of pollination season, because the insects aren't going to remember exactly what's there, you know. I mean, they'll come back and everything like that, but if things are very different, they have to learn a bunch of new stuff. So I try to make it as easy as possible. So you create edges with lines, okay? Whether it's the line of a swale, the line of masses, okay, the line of a pathway. So that's what I mean by edges. So you have anywhere you transition between a big patch of something to another patch, there are edges.
Great, thank you. And one more question right now. Can you elaborate a little more on the dangers of the outdoor lighting? Why would outdoor solar lights be harmful to insects?
Well, so you've all seen moths fly to lights. And what happens when they fly to a light is that they can become exhausted and die. They can be eaten more easily because they're busy fluttering against this artificial light. It can mess up their migration, and you can lose so many. Solar lights don't turn off unless there's some way to turn them off. And I actually did spend a couple of years doing lighting design, long story, but there's really no, people say, well, I need the lights on for security purposes. And actually there is no evidence that lights on all the time deter bad behavior. When lights come on with motion sensors, that's what you want. You want light to illuminate motion, or people moving through areas that they're not supposed to be in. If you leave your lights on all the time, it just makes it sort of easy for people to behave badly because they can see what they're doing a lot better. And so putting up blackout fabric, blackout shades is a very easy way to help if you can't get out to the garden, but you feel like you've got to do something good. I would highly recommend it. We've been doing that now for at our house for over a year now, and I have so many moths in our yard. It's amazing. So it really makes a difference.
Thank you.
Okay. Shall we move on?
Sure, we can take some questions at the end.
Yes. All right. So how to create a habitat plan. How do you draw something? Okay, well, it actually isn't that hard. What I tell people is get some graph paper. Okay, this is what graph paper looks like, everybody knows. And then measure your site. You want to note everything that you have there, utilities, existing vegetation, like where are the trees, where are the shrubs, you know, where's the sidewalk, where's the driveway, other features. And then using your site measurements, you can draw something to scale. That is, 1/4 inch equals a foot, 1/8 of an inch equals a foot, and so on. And so let's say this graph paper is about 1/8 of an inch. And so each of these little grids will be, squares will be 1 foot. So you'll show everything on graph paper, add your north arrow so you know where the shady side is going to be, where the sun is coming up, where it's going down, where the hot stuff is. Okay, graph paper, it's your friend. And then the first thing you do, don't start laying out the plants first. Lay out things like pathways, patios, hardscape, places for people to walk and do whatever they want to do outside, vegetable garden, tennis courts, all those things. Once you have that structure, then you can start adding plant structure. So you add plants from your plant palette. Okay, so here's your pathway first. And the way that you lay out plants to get the spacing correct so you don't have a gigantic jungle of things is show the plants at their mature diameter. And you can find that information also on CalScape. So you can draw a circle showing, you know, your big stuff, about how big that is. And the way to get the spacing correct is that each of these circles equals a plant, and they should just barely touch or slightly overlap. Okay, and that's how you get your spacing for planting purposes. Super easy. You get a circle template. You just draw these things in, or you can try freehanding it in. Plant in odd numbers for massing. That's looks very natural. Again, masses of at least 3 feet in diameter to enhance foraging efficiency and attractiveness to insects. Plant your large trees and shrubs first, and then layer in your perennials, annuals, bulbs, vines, and so forth. And again, leave bare dirt for nesting. So this is what a planting plan looks like. You know, we've got our blue plants here, our green plants there, yellow ones there. They all are different plants, but you can see the spacing there. What plants to use and why? Okay, so trees first. Many trees are drought tolerant once they're established. Trees are great for saving water. Okay, the things that trees do, they just provide so much in a landscape. They form hubs for wildlife to move from one area to another area. They can provide huge nectar sources as well as other habitat resources for butterflies and moth larvae. And trees are keystone species, which means they support dozens or hundreds or even thousands of other species. Oaks particularly are good for that. Quercus agrifolia or coast live oak, and these are just a few. Prunus salicifolia, Fraxinus velutina, and so forth. And I say to choose wisely. You want to select a tree that will fit your site. So don't plant a gigantic oak in your side yard. Okay, this is why. So here's a coast live oak, a huge tree. This guy here, that's my 6 foot 3 inch tall husband. He's in there for scale. This tree would not work in a side yard. Okay, there are other trees that would work better. Contrast that with a picture of the Central Valley in November. No vegetation. Okay, so we have trees absorbing water, releasing it into the air, cooling and cleaning it, forming half the rain cycle, preventing deserts forming, really providing a lot of ecosystem services, as well as providing a lot of larval food resources. Here's a California sister butterfly, probably feeding on Quercus chrysolepis, another wonderful oak that we have. Beautiful creature. Again, if you like butterflies, plant some oaks. Okay, shrubs next. Again, this is just a short list, and I actually show some things that you can substitute these for. Again, our shrubs that we have provide a huge variety of floral and vegetative resources, as well as habitat. And the big three that I like to consider: Arctostaphylos. Here you have a bumblebee on the Arctostaphylos. Ceanothus over here, and then Eriogonum. But again, lots to choose from. Early blooming plants, we love Ceanothus. This is a valley violet that we have. Great food for the black-tailed bumblebee, one of the 2 bumblebees that we have here in Palo Alto. This is Bombus melanopygus. You can see there's a cute little black tail there. Perennials, again, very short list of everything that we have, but these are plants that we have in all of our gardens. Phacelia species, Cirsium, which is a thistle, which are super important, asters, penstemon, and so on. Lots to choose from. Annuals, things that come up, live for a year, and then die back. Annuals are great to fill in spots and provide a little extra oomph for the buffet, I like to say. Our annuals also here in California are the most under threat natives from non-native grasses. 3 easy annuals, pretty nice really in every garden: poppies, Gilead capitata, Phacelia tanacetifolia. Poppies are great because they provide only pollen. They don't provide any nectar, but they are also a larval food source for several moth species. And they're easy, super easy. So let's talk about food, unless we want to stop for a quick second and take a question. I keep seeing the questions pop up.
Thanks, Juanita. A couple quick questions on trees. One, none of the trees that you mentioned are fruit trees. Is there a reason for that? And also we had a specific question about whether olive trees are okay in this area.
Right. So fruit trees, you know, people have to eat too. And you can, and we do have some native fruit trees here. We have native nut trees, certainly. And so I actually have hazelnut trees in a couple of my gardens. Those are good. And I also in my home garden have an orange tree and 2 apple trees, as well as a pomegranate. And it's fine to plant fruit trees, but if you surround these plants with native plants, you'll have a lot of pollination and you'll have more fruit. And what was the other question?
It was on olive trees and whether they're okay.
Yeah, I mean, olive trees are very ornamental looking. There are certainly types that have not a lot of fruit. They don't lose a lot of their fruit because they can be kind of messy. It might be nice to have a tree that gives you fruit. And I do use them occasionally in my designs, but I don't use them as much anymore because they really don't provide the bang for your buck in terms of providing habitat resources for insects. You know, an oak can provide food for up to 5,000 species, and an olive tree just can't compete with that. Even though they are very showy, you know, again, it's a matter of preference. If you like olives and you have to have an olive tree, by all means, but try to get the rest of your plants to be at least 70% native so you can feed the birds. So, but let's talk about food because, as I always like to say, it's all about the mealtime. So consider the floral resources. For bees, remember they're pollinating. Pollen, I'll just talk briefly about that. It's a source of protein. And bees are really the only insect that feeds their larvae pollen. Okay, it's the sole source of protein to feed their larvae. Most other insects are feeding their babies other insects. That's where they get their food from. And all pollen is not created equally. So you have some species of bees that can't live on just any old pollen. Some are very specific. Again, this is why you need a variety of pollen sources. So like, for example, the bumblebee here. A bumblebee is a generalist. They will feed on a lot of different kinds of plants. They're not terribly picky. But if you plant for bumblebees, you'll be planting for a lot of other insects. Here we have them feeding on Gilia, Eriogonum grandirubescens, Phacelia, Ecmispon, poppies, Eriogonum, aster, Scrophularia, and Monardella. If you want bumblebees, that's your plant list. Other resources, nectar. Sugar is a big motivator for a lot of animals. It certainly is for me. And so you want to plant a good nectar source for insects. They need the sugar to fuel their flight behaviors. Some insects travel quite a distance to find food. And so you really want to provide a good energy source for them. And one great plant is Monardella villosa. Very minty smelling, but it also provides food for skipper butterflies, bumblebees, all kinds of insects will eat the nectar there. The ability to carry pollen. This actually directly relates to where bees are going to be nesting, okay? And even though they can fly really long distance, like most animals, if they don't have to go that far for food, that's better. So the smaller bees actually like to go less than 150 feet, but most bees between 150 to 1,500 feet between food source and nest. And you know, the smaller bees will actually, if you have a yard that provides enough food for them, will nest right in your yard. So they literally go only about 7 or 8 feet in my yard for their food. And these are a couple of different kinds of plants here. This is, I believe, is an aster, and I've got a nice melissoides bee here. You can tell by the little puffy legs there with the pollen that she's got in the back there. And then we have leafcutter bees, and you can tell because of the abdomen there. So different ways of transporting it, but you know, that it plays a role into what you plant in your yard. Again, let's talk about pollen here. Here we have another a Bombus melanopygus. You can see she's nectaring, but she's also brushing across these anthers here with her fur. And the pollen and the bee, the flowers and the bee have different electrical charges. So the pollen is actually attracted to the bee, hops over, and then she'll groom those into her carrying basket there on her hind leg. Again, the Valley Violet ceanothus, wonderful plant, blooms in January. And this actually was taken in January. So this bumblebee doesn't really hibernate all that much. Again, Grindelia, wonderful plant. Here we have this nice small bee gathering up the pollen. She's letting it fall into her abdomen and then putting it into her hind legs here for transport. She's using her antenna actually to sort of taste and smell the pollen, and she knows that it's good stuff. And here we have another small bee on Salvia apiana. You can see there's the mouth parts on the anther there, and she will put all of this pollen on her leg then to carry back to the nest. Tiny bees. Other great plants, and again, if you like the look of these cute little bees, plant these plants and you will have them coming. We have this beautiful creature on coffeeberry, another little bee on Grindelia camporum, and you can tell going after the pollen. This one is nectarine. You can see the mouth part extended there. This one is actually going after the pollen. You can tell what they're doing by what the mouth is doing. If the tongue is extended, they're going after the nectar. If the mandibles are chewing away, they're going after the pollen. Some more great plants to try. Nice annual, very showy, Clarkia amoena. Another annual Leptosiphon. You can see she's got some really large pollen baskets back there. Poppies. Poppies are great. We've got a bumblebee here, another little bee here, a couple of beetles. This is actually the coastal poppy. You can tell it has got that little orange cross in the center. And then Monardella villosa. It's a great nectar plant, but it also provides pollen as well. So a good all-around plant there. Asters. Asters are great. They form colonies. They can create a nice mass, and you can see all the different bees that will be attracted to asters. And the aster leaves provide larval food sources as well. You can see this melissoides there, this bumblebee. Look at that leaf cutter abdomen. That's how she carries her pollen back to the nest. Again, Arctostaphylos. Here we have a blue orchard bee, beautiful creature. This is in my front yard. And then we've got lupins, great nectar plant. You can tell she's going for the nectar because she's got her proboscis extended where her tongue will come out. So you can tell what they're going for, but what their mouth is doing. Penstemons for nectar as well. Bumblebees can crawl inside as well as smaller bees. And penstemons are great plants as well. We have a lot of different kinds, super attractive for pollinators, and they like no water. They really like it dry and hot. And I will sing the praises of the Phacelia species. We've got Phacelia tanacetifolia here, which is an annual. Here we've got Phacelia belanderi, which is a short-lived perennial, and then Phacelia californica, which is a short-lived perennial as well. But all great nectar sources as well as pollen. You can see she's got some blue pollen back there that she's collected from these plants as well. So super tasty and fueling all kinds of behaviors. Again, other plants to put in your garden. If you want these cute creatures in your garden, plant Erigeron species for both pollen and nectar. So a couple of little facts. In general, blue and purple mean nectar, white and yellow mean pollen. Bees really can't see red. They do see ultraviolet. They prefer the color blue because blue generally means sugar. So those are the colors that will be predominant in your habitat garden if you're planting for bees. So before I head into maintenance, let's take a couple of quick questions.
Sure. There's a question on whether bees like California buckeye.
Yes, the native bees actually do. The buckeye is in mass quantities. It's poisonous to honeybees, but it doesn't seem to affect the native bees as much.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And do the plant descriptions help with knowing whether or not bees will create a nest in the yard?
The plant descriptions. I think what really is going to determine whether they're making a nest in the yard has to do with actually more of the quantity of food. If you have just one or two plants that are blooming in your yard, and like you have one lone phacelia, that plant will be visited, but they're probably not going to have nesting. You're going, for the right kind of habitat, nesting behavior, you're going to have to provide a lot of food. That seems to be the thing that works the best. You'll have insects coming to your yard, but they may not stay if there isn't enough food.
Thank you.
Okay, so maintenance. So in a habitat, when you plant, and some people are converting their yards over to natives, and you know, if you've got a yard full of non-native plants, I would say don't just go wholesale and remove everything and start over. Take a little bit at a time. Maybe change out one bed at a time. And when you do, the major thing to do at first is to keep the weeds at bay. For irrigation, probably irrigating the first 1 to 3 years to establish, and then kind of dial it back as you get things more established. And people ask a lot of questions about irrigation, and this is all about the water. I actually have turned off the irrigation at my house. I hand water things. I don't water on hot days because you don't want hot, moist soil because that encourages pathogens. And so I try to water when it's cooler out, and maybe once a week for plants that are kind of in the middle of being established. Earlier plants will get water every couple of days until I know that they're not going to just die. And then the more established plants, it really varies. Like I planted a toyon, I've never watered it, and it's fine. Other plants, like the Lepichinia, for example, Lepichinia fragrans, that gets water maybe once every 2 weeks. So it really depends. Wait to prune until insects have emerged. You don't need to fertilize. When I'm planting, sometimes I will use cactus mix for good drainage if I don't have enough good soil. You want to mulch to control weeds, and then eventually that mulch will be eaten down into the soil by soil organisms. And then after that, you can use leaves or just leave bare soil. But you basically also do want to leave areas of bare dirt for nesting, and don't use leaf blowers. The whole point of your habitat is to have caterpillars, larvae, and bees, you don't want to be blowing them away and drying them out with a 200-mile-an-hour wind coming out of a leaf blower. So leaf blower is bad. And I shouldn't have to say this, but don't use pesticides, herbicides, or fungicides. A fungicide might not kill a bee outright, but they are so under stress from all the other things. One thing, it can be like death by 1,000 cuts. So don't use things that kill other things. seeds from your annuals, give them away as presents. I always wait till things really, really dry out before I cut them down. And the annuals can bloom continuously to the point where the whole plant will be dry, but there'll be one little bloom on the end. And you think, okay, once that's gone, that's done, and then another little bud comes out. And this can go on for weeks and months. Okay, leaves as mulch. If you want butterflies, leave your leaves, especially under trees like oaks, because what happens is that those insects laying their eggs on the leaves, they eat the leaves, they become larvae, and they drop down into the leaf mulch below. And that's where they overwinter, and they spend a lot of their time as a larva. If you blow those leaves away, there go your butterflies, and you won't have them in the spring. But also birds really like those leaf piles and will be going in there and finding some protein. So leave your leaves. Leaves are great. They encourage fungal decomposition, which is good. And you just want to make sure that the leaves are not up against the trunk of a tree or shrub, because that will trap in too much moisture. If you think it looks a little messy, I like to put a little skim coat of bark chips on the top, just like one chip thick, and it looks nice and neat. And it doesn't even have to be that thick. So the leaf layer can be 3 inches or less. And this is actually my dirty glove holding some broken down leaves here in my own yard. Again, bare soil, important because we have nesting occurring underground. And bees will nest in bare dirt, but they will also certainly nest in your lawn as well, or between stepping stones, really anywhere there's bare dirt. And so if you look for a lot of low flying, buzzing around at ground level, you can follow those insects back to their burrows. So here's a little burrow. And this is colony that's pretty stable over at the Island Drive Garden. And these bees forage in the Island Drive Garden. The Island Drive Garden is about 4,000 square feet. So it's not small, but they don't have to go very far for their food. Again, pruning decisions, really wait to prune. A lot of insects will be inside stems, and sometimes insects, remember, they provide food for other insects' babies, and so you can have insects hiding. And so if you're pruning these leaves, you're going to prune out all of your inhabitants of your habitat. So here's Salvia apiana, which forms a great blanket, Lepicinia fragrans, nice, soft and fuzzy. And this actually here down in the corner is a dry stem of Scrophularia californica. And these are katydid eggs. Now, if I had pruned that off, I would not have any katydids, and then the lizards would have gone hungry. So again, look closely before you prune, or just wait until insects have emerged. So if you want to know when to prune, take a look to see when these eggs open. And they stayed closed for several months. Many insects spend most of their time as eggs or larvae. The adult phase of their lives is very short typically, and that's the one that we see. So again, here's a great picture of a wasp going inside a hollow stem of the hummingbird sage that we have at Island Drive. Again, so once we trim these, we were deadheading these, we just pile them up and leave them. And those provide more nesting sites. Remember, many insects spend their time as an egg or larva. So here's a moth larva on poppy. Another, I don't even know what this insect is, but again, these are bird food. So, and they can spend a lot of time as a larva if they don't get eaten first. Your ongoing decisions. So really spend a lot of time looking to see what you have. You know, do you have nesters? You know, where are they nesting? You know, where are the butterflies coming from? And this will help you decide what to plant. So observe and research. Again, Calscape, it's like my go-to source. And then look to see what provides forage with this particular plant. If you're interested in, say, this plant versus that plant, compare. Does this feed 175 insects? This one only feeds 20. I only have so much room in my garden. Maybe I'll feed as many as possible. How much water is needed? Does this plant provide nesting opportunities? How hard is it to grow? And when you take care of a lot of public gardens, if something's being all diva-ish, it's not going to last in my garden. So I try to plant things that are going to live and not require a lot of my time. Again, how does it enhance pollinator resources and other resources? Are we assisting a northerly migration of plant species? As the climate warms, are we going to see more Southern California plants move their way north? And then how connected is this garden to other natural spaces? So are you next to a wildland interface? Are you next to a park? What are you close to? These are considerations. The more that you have connectivity between habitats, the better it is for biodiversity. What we see is that connection between environments decreases the amount of possibility for extinction, because you can lose a population over here, but this can rebound. If these are connected, you can have gene flow between both areas. So connectivity is hugely important. So again, observation. You have to really look to see what is actually going on in terms of what's living in your garden. As we know, information is not revealed all at once. Okay, information is continuously being updated as we get better and better at observing things. And so our knowledge base is always growing. And the scales of things are very different. So in terms of information not being revealed all at once, I was taking a picture of this Silene, and I did not notice this little tiny baby katydid until later when I actually went back and looked at the picture. And sure enough, it saw me before I saw it. So again, information evolves over time. These are the best practices as I know them up to this point, and I'm always looking for better ways to do things. And my rubric that the measuring stick that I use is how many species do I see? So I spend a lot of time observing and taking photographs. And I'll just say, so among the various ecosystem services, once you understand about these interrelationships and interconnectedness between everything and enhance that and get better at enhancing the interconnectedness, your appreciation and enjoyment of the complexity becomes enhanced as well. And I just leave you with a katydid, and that's actually in my backyard. And, you know, I just thought this organism really embodied the spirit of the habitat. And that's my presentation.
Thank you so much, Juanita. We have several more questions that we didn't get to during the presentation. So it would be great if we could run through some of those, and then I'll just remind the participants, if you have another question, feel free to type it in the chat or raise your hand. I think we have one hand that's been raised for quite a while. It's Sandy Todd. So I'm going to give her an opportunity to ask her question out loud.
Okay.
Well, are you there, Sandy?
Are you talking to me?
Yes, we saw that you had your hand raised.
I'm trying to think of a question. There's so much. I've got, I tried to have an all-native garden. It didn't quite work out. Now I've got mostly fruit and vegetables, but I am still learning. The ones natives that I have I'm learning how to take care of them, and I think that's really important. Is there a really good source of information out there, either online or in books, to tell you how to take care of them month by month?
So the the go-to place that I go for information for California native plants is the California Native Plant Society. They have just a plethora of information on their site, as well as videos, links to other sites that talk about maintenance. They really have all the information that you could possibly need on their site.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't go to their site regularly, but I guess I better. Thank you.
We've had a couple questions come up about pests. How do you prevent animal pests from having a buffet party on your garden?
So pests. Well, because insects are food for other insects in general, what I find works best in terms of keeping a balance is to provide a lot of plant resources. So if you have a huge diversity of plant resources, you're going to have a huge diversity of insects coming in, and they will eat each other. In terms of like aphids, for example, I don't worry about aphids. I mean, they are pests, certainly, but they are also, as I like to call them, the soft-shelled crab of the insect world. And I let the insects work it out. And the way that I promote them working it out is to invite as many to the table as possible. And I really don't have a lot of problems with pests. So I do have fruit trees in my yard, and so the apple trees, and so I spend some time in the spring bagging the apples, so I don't have to use any sort of pesticides on them. And what that means is that you can get these mesh bags that don't allow insects to access the fruit, and you basically bag up the little apple when it's small, and it ripens up inside the bag and comes out perfect in the fall when they get ripe. But really, the best pest management for me is to provide a really juicy, tasty buffet full of masses of plants that are, every ingredient at the salad bar, because you'll have a huge diversity come in. Trust the food chain.
Does that help with some of the non-cute insects like mosquitoes or flies as well?
So mosquitoes, the scourge of mankind, certainly. But the way that I deal with those is I make sure that we don't have any standing water in our yard. And then I actually have a couple of garments that have mosquito repellent built into them. So I have a little jacket that I wear, a mesh jacket that is mosquito repellent because I'm very attractive to mosquitoes. And then I use a non-DEET mosquito repellent wipe on myself before I go out. And then slugs, the only thing that I use occasionally around my vegetables to keep the slugs out is I do use Sluggo, which is specific for those, and it is a natural substance as well. I don't use it very often. I do use it around my lettuce because it's not that appetizing to find slime on the leaves. But other than that, the diversity of plants really provides the diversity of insects that are going to chow down on each other.
What about gophers? We have a few questions about how to get rid of or manage gophers, moles, and raccoons humanely.
Oh boy. Yeah, so gophers are a challenge. When I tell people to plant things to keep the gophers away, what you can use in the planting hole itself is to provide a basket of maybe chicken wire, a small gauge chicken wire that has a small opening to protect the roots that way. Some people like to put some gravel in at the bottom to keep them from undermining those baskets. That's one thing to do. For raccoons, boy, you know, they're really attracted to trash. So, you know, keep trash covered. I use a lot of chicken wire to cover up things that I don't want the squirrels to get to. I use wire baskets turned upside down over some of my more valuable plants that I use as mother plants. I've got trilliums that were quite expensive, and the last thing I want are the squirrels digging those up. So I use a lot of baskets over the top of those, and I just got those at the Container Store, so I have a lot of those, and they're easy to reuse. And you can get a roll of chicken wire and create little baskets to put over the tops of things. So barriers of that nature are useful. You know, if you don't want to use any sort of chemical deterrents, and you certainly don't want to try poisons, because those get into the environment and into the food chain and kill everything else.
Great, thank you. You mentioned before avoiding fungicides. Would you include copper spray for peach leaf curl in that list to avoid?
I don't use any sort of fungicide on any of my plants. The way to, I think, avoid the problem with fungus is to try to keep things dry and water at the appropriate times. So, you know, that I always worry about those sorts of things, getting, you know, insects landing on those things, dying. I don't know if there's really a good answer for that one.
And you'd mentioned before avoiding watering when it's hot. Is that to prevent fungus as well, or are there other reasons?
Yes. Yes, warm and moist creates mold and fungus and pathogens that don't need to be in the soil. And it can also kill the good stuff in the soil that doesn't like it that way, because warm, moist soil is not really a Mediterranean thing.
We had a couple questions earlier on in the evening about design. Is there a website or software that you recommend for creating designs for those of us who aren't as artistic as you are?
So, you know, I don't really think that design software is as good as a human. And I think that, you know, if you were to, you know, go back and take a look at that imaginary habitat that I drew in there and sort of use that as your guide, that would be helpful. You know, design, when I'm designing things for clients and things like that, I use computer-aided drafting, which, you know, it doesn't tell me what to plant. I have to know that myself. It just draws the lines and the circles for me. It doesn't actually put in the plants for me. I have to make those decisions. But if you really just sketch something out on graph paper that's to scale, you know, see how deep your lot is and where your doors and windows are, you know, it really is just a matter of placing the trees first, and then the shrubs and the perennials. It, you know, people are kind of afraid sometimes to really just go for it, but if you plant things in masses, it's almost foolproof. You just keep adding more plants, and you know, once you have your big stuff in, then you can put in things like vines that can crawl up through other shrubs, and that way you can get twice as many plants in the same space, and also create connectivity both vertically and horizontally.
Fantastic. Do you have any other tips for how to plan for blooming phases when developing your plans?
So you can look at the bloom times that Calscape has, and you know, look at let's say you want to plant a bunch of different kinds of ceanothus. And ceanothus is a great evergreen plant. And it comes in different forms. It comes in a ground cover form, it comes in a shrub form, and it comes in a tree form. So, you know, depending on what your space looks like say you want to have a sense of a little bit more openness, so you probably want to go with a ground cover form. Within the ceanothus family, you can have early, mid, and late blooming varieties. So you don't have to have all your ceanothus blooming in January. You can have some, which I had blooming in January, the Valley Violet, but I also have some blooming right now. It's a variety called Skylark, which is more of a shrub, a bigger shrubby form. So once what I would recommend to people is go for the big things first, and then, you know, pick out other things based on bloom times that you can find on Calscape and layer those in and do big masses of those. Something that blooms almost all the time that I have in most of the gardens is Heterotheca, which is Heterotheca sessifolia San Bruno Mountain. It doesn't really need any water, blooms almost all year round. A lot of plants like that in California. Some are very seasonal. A way to get a big burst of bloom kind of early to mid-summer is with annuals. Later in the summer, it becomes a little bit harder to find things that are blooming. You know, so that's always a challenge, but you can find those. You just have to keep looking for those as well. Some of the late bloomers that we have, there's the Eriogonums certainly are late blooming. The California fuchsia is late blooming. You could probably get poppies still blooming, goldenrod, so a lot of choices.
And on the topic of annuals, do most of the annuals you've talked about reseed themselves, or do you need to reseed them every year?
The ones that I'm showing reseed themselves pretty well. I'm always experimenting with different annuals to see what is easiest that reblooms and doesn't turn into a thug in the gardens. Poppies generally are pretty easy. They can be a little weedy sometimes. So Clarkias are also good. The Phacelias that I mentioned, the Phacelia tenacetifolia, things that are a little bit more challenging that I haven't shown, but I've tried them in the gardens. Something like cream cups, which are a beautiful native flower, really have not reseeded themselves. So what I like to do, if I find a flower, an annual that I like, I'll plant a few of those and see if they reseed themselves in the garden. Gilia capitata has been very successful in that regard. And so it's like you need to plant some of these just once and you'll have them forever. Some of the ones are a little bit more challenging, you know, but the ones that I'm showing that reseed themselves easily are the ones that I showed, like the poppies, the Phacelias, the Clarkias. Those have been very successful. Things like tidy tips, I haven't had as much luck with those. You know, one of the great things about Calscape is they do have a lot of great resources for seeds. One of the places I like to get seeds is Larner Seeds up in Bolinas. They have a really nice selection of very easy to seed, sow in place annuals, which is where I get most of my, well, I won't say most, I get a bunch of seeds from them. I've really not been disappointed. I do try a lot of different kinds of seeds. Some are quite challenging, but for me, that's part of the joy, is to see what works and what doesn't work. But seeds are cheap, so, you know, it's not really a huge investment if you buy a few packets.
Thank you. What is your recommendation for avoiding plants that are poisonous to dogs and cats, but still including plants that are beautiful to the eye and good pollinators?
Right. So basically try not to plant those plants that are poisonous to dogs and cats. You know, I mean, I know dogs will eat just about anything, and both native plants and non-native plants are poisonous. And a lot of people plant oleander, which is extremely poisonous. And, you know, again, you can look on Calscape to see, you know, if it's a toxic plant, and look it up beforehand before you plant it. And just make sure that it's not. And, you know, I mean, I don't have a dog. I have 3 indoor cats. So I don't worry too much. We don't have any house plants because they will eat them, and they're very sneaky. And so they just require a lot of surveillance. We keep an eye on what they're doing. But yeah, I mean, just try to plant things that are not toxic to the dogs.
Thanks. What was the name of the plant you had mentioned earlier that you plant under walking pavers?
Ah, yes, Viola adunca. And I'm very entranced with our viola species. We have a lot of different kinds. I love pansies, but pansies are not native. So these are the native variety. We have a number of different kinds, and they do I believe they are the larval food source for is it the painted lady? Or it might be a painted lady one, but anyhow, those are great. And they stay nice and low, and they're wonderful between stepping stones, and they do spread easily by seed.
Speaking of stepping stones, what do you recommend for stepping stones?
Basically, well, I use a few different things. Sometimes I use a thick piece of flagstone. Other times it's a precast concrete paver that you can get from Stepstone, which is really nice. Big flat rocks. These are things that I like for stepping stones. People like stepping stones because they're easier if you're walking barefoot out in the yard, as opposed to mulch, which can give you splinters. So really, just anything that's not going to, you know, be too tippy when you stand on it. So something that's relatively thick and heavy, so it's not going to move around a whole lot.
Great, thank you. And then how sensitive are California natives? For example, somebody who lives in the Pacifica area, would they be successful in raising or growing natives from the Central Valley or from the Alpine, or is it much more regionally specific?
It does tend to be more regional. You know, that being said, you can kind of recreate those places where you find those plants if you look for the kind of the microclimate in your own yard. So if something likes to be cooler and moister, that might go on the north side in a shady spot. Something that likes it hot and dry might go into a south-facing area. So here we can certainly plant things from the Central Valley and from Southern California if it's hot and dry and they have good drainage. The coastal plants tend to have a little bit of different microclimate, you know, the cool overcast. They don't like to be in the full sun. And that's actually something that I've discovered, is that a lot of plants really do appreciate some shade. Not everything likes to bake in the hot sun. You know, there are a few plants that do, but many plants do like a little bit of shade. I actually find that shade is good to kind of slow plants down. Otherwise, they can get really big, really fast, and become kind of thugs. So anything that they can get like a moderate growing pace can be accomplished a little bit more easily with a little bit of shade.
Thank you. Do you have any recommendations for where to purchase your plants? Are some of the ones that you mentioned difficult to find in our typical local nurseries?
Yes, yes, there are several really great native plant nurseries around the Bay Area, here in Palo Alto, we have Summer Winds, which is not native plants, but they have a native plants section, which is really quite good. There's one out towards the coast, Yerba Buena. There's East Bay Wilds in the South Bay. Many of the California Native Plant Societies do plant sales every month. There are some that you can get from Annie's Annuals that are mail order, which is, really terrific. They have a small selection there. There are some up in the North Bay. I've scouted out like every single native plant nursery. I've gone all the way up to Fulton, up past Santa Rosa to California Flora Nursery, which is really awesome, as well as down to Santa Cruz to Central Coast Wilds. So what you can do, though, on the Calscape website, they have links to each of these nurseries, and the nurseries post availability pages so you can see what they have. So if there's a plant that you want that nobody seems to have in the nurseries, and it's like, where am I going to find it? Look to see if it's on an availability list. And sometimes you will find things that you didn't think you would ever find. What I've noticed is that, well, one of my favorites, East Bay Wilds, is for the plant connoisseur. Certainly some very rare species there, which are nice to have. But some of these native plant nurseries like Central Coast Wilds also do contract growing, and sometimes they have leftovers, so you can end up with something that's really interesting from them as well. But again, look at their websites, their availability list, and then give a call to make sure that they have any left if they haven't updated their lists.
Thank you. What about hummingbirds? Do you have recommendations for what to plant to attract those cute little creatures?
They will go after anything with a tubular flower. So they will go after Arctostaphylos. They will go for the Scrophularia californica, which has those little red sort of cup-shaped flowers. They love Monardella villosa. Anything with a tubular flower, they will go after.
And we have a question about planting with California poppies. What other plants go well with the poppies, and do you recommend waiting until the poppy bloom before planting the new plant?
So poppies kind of will go where they want to go. When the pods explode and the seeds fly everywhere, they really get into everything. So I basically, when I plant poppies, I seed them in place, and sometimes the seeds don't come up the first year. And that's something else about seeds, is that they don't always sprout the first year. Some take months to germinate. That being said, my favorite combination with poppies is a poppy with Phacelia tenacetifolia, because I'm providing pollen and nectar. And that combination is a bumblebee magnet.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
On the topic of native ground cover, will native ground cover deter moles?
That's a very good question. I have no idea. I think they may be more determined, but one of the things that we can do, remember, it's all about the mealtime. So rodents are food for other things. And so one might put up an owl box or a hawk perch where they can see these critters running around and maybe help out with the reducing the populations. In fact, that's one of the things that is done in some nature preserves where they have a pond that's created by a dam. Sometimes those dams get infiltrated by rodents, and that makes the dam kind of leaky, which is not good. And so oftentimes at each end of a dam, you'll see a perch. And that's exactly what it's for, is to get a little help, birds of prey, to take care of the rodent problem.
Great, thanks. And where would somebody find the common names for some of the plants that you've mentioned rather than the scientific names?
Can you hear me?
Now we can. You froze for just a second.
Are you there?
You're going in and out a little bit. Let's see if this works. Where can we find some of the common names for plants you mentioned versus the scientific names?
Sometimes those common names are listed as well on the Cowscape website. I only rarely use a common name because I find those to be not very precise. And common names can sometimes be shared amongst different plants. So it's really a better idea to use a scientific name because then you know exactly what you're getting. You're getting exactly what you think you're getting.
Thank you. And let's talk about money for a minute. For the sample garden that you showed, what type of budget would you need to build a garden like that?
You could probably do it for less than $1,000.
Wow, fantastic.
Yep. Yep.
And how much maintenance would be needed annually once the plants are established?
So for the imaginary garden that I put in there, once everything would be established, really the main maintenance would be to sort of rake leaves into piles and to prune down anything that was completely dead, and pulling weeds. And the more of the natives that you put in, they're going to change the soil chemistry, and it's going to make it less likely that non-natives will thrive in that same environment. So over time, maintenance will actually become less.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
If you're seeding something like Gia capitata for the first time, do you just cast the seeds or are they more finicky and do they need some special treatment?
Oh, so Gilead capitata is easy, and I literally harvest pounds of that every year, and I just throw it where I want it to go because it will sprout anywhere. It sprouts in the cracks in the sidewalk.
Interesting. That's
Mhm.
Question about a Palo Alto resident who has a camphor tree in the front yard. Are the leaves from this tree good for insects, or should she remove them and let them mulch?
So I have camphor trees next to the primrose garden, and boy, these are just the worst trees. I just hate them. But I do leave the leaves for the most part. We do sweep them up from the sidewalk. I don't, because they're not native, I don't know about the insects that might eat them, but there probably really aren't that many that do. And so it's like, well, you know, what are they good for? Well, the leaves do provide mulch, so I do leave them in place. And mostly because I got tired of raking them out of the plants. But once the plants got big enough, then I just left them. But we do, along the edge of the sidewalk, remove them because people have to walk through there. But they're really horrible trees. They're very weedy. They drop branches all the time. They drop seeds and continuously pulling out camphor seedlings. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to replace these camphor trees with some oaks. So we'll see what happens.
Great. All right, here's a fun one for you. What camera do you use for your insect pictures? They're terrific.
Thank you. I use the most excellent Canon 80, EOS 80D, and I have a macro zoom lens on it as well. It's like a 90 to 135 millimeters macro lens.
Great.
Yes, so I was very interested in macro photography after being very jealous of other bug photographers, and so inquired as to what they used. And the Canon series, the EOS, the 60, 70, and 80 seems to be a kind of a standard one that people use with a macro lens.
Fantastic. Well, you sure do a great job. Right,
Thank you.
have 3 more questions for you right now. Violas have psyllids. Now what?
violets have what?
I may be mispronouncing this. P-S-I-L-I-D-S.
Like an insect of some kind, a little bug that gets on them. Again, you know, the way I look at myself as I am the caterer. I will provide a huge variety of things for the insects to eat, and then they can all work it out. And we don't really have a lot of bugs eating our violets at the Primrose Garden. They are spreading nicely. So really, you know, if you only had violets, then they're tasty food for one species. But if you have violets surrounded by 70 or 80 other species, you're going to have all of those insects looking for a meal. And remember, every insect is a meal for another insect.
Excellent. Do you have a recommended width for pathways in a small yard?
I like 2 feet.
Great.
That's kind of the minimum, yeah.
Thank you. And then our last question, and I think it's a great one, where
Yeah.
the address is for the public California native gardens that you have designed in the Bay Area and talked about tonight?
So if you do a Google search for Palo Alto pollinator gardens, our gardens pop up on Google Maps. One of our volunteers put us on Google Maps, and there's a little pin dropped into locations. The Primrose Garden is along Embarcadero Road, as is the Gwynda Garden. The Hopkins Garden, the Arcadia Garden, those are along Newell Road. And then the Island Drive Garden is off of Island Drive. It's on Island Drive between Hamilton and Edgewood. So they're all pretty close together. They make a nice little walking tour, a little circuit of about 3 miles. So if you need exercise and need to look at some plants, one could generate a map and have a nice afternoon.
That sounds like a wonderful way to spend an afternoon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, that is all the questions that we have. So thank you so much, Juanita, for sticking around to answer all these questions and for the great information. And thank you to all of you who are still here listening with us. A couple closing notes. There have been some questions about the presentation. We will post the video on our website probably by Friday. And we'll also be sending out a post-event survey tomorrow. We'd really appreciate if you could take a few minutes to fill it out. Doing the virtual landscape classes is still very new to us. This is actually only the 3rd virtual class that Bosca's ever held. So we would love to get your feedback on how this worked for you or what we could do to provide better in the future. Thank you all so much. Hope you stay safe and healthy and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you.